Hello, Sixth Formers. So today we are going to be looking at the Christina Rossetti poetry collection. We're going to be starting this unit. It is part of your paper 3 exam that you will be doing at the end of year 13. So our LO today is to consider how contextual factors impact Rossetti's writing. So that is essentially what we'll be focusing on today, what we can uncover about her life as a child, her parents, etc., and how that very clearly impacts on a lot of her poetry as we go through the course. The first thing I need you to do is to make sure that you get a copy of the book on the screen. So at time of recording it is down for £3.59 on Amazon. You may possibly be able to get it cheaper elsewhere, I'm sure, but it ideally needs to be the Christina Rossetti Selected Poems with the editor of Dina Rowe. It's the Penguin Classics edition, and the picture is there just to help you find it essentially on Amazon. So do make sure you can try and find that and aim to get that as soon as you can. We will be giving you copies of the poems, but as you'll see from the next slide, there are a lot of them, and it's sometimes helpful to get a range of poems, even if you're not studying them, so that you can see how her career develops. So here is a lot of the exam information. It is paper 3 is a 2-hour 15-minute exam, and this is the second part of it. So Rossetti is the second part of it, and part A is your modern poetry, so where you've studied things like the Gun, Giuseppe, history, etc. But this one is just on Rossetti poems, and you will have a choice of 2 questions, which is always good. And the question will name one poem, and you will select your own poem to discuss in conjunction with the theme that the question gives you. It is, however, not a comparative essay, which is very different to what part A is. So part A is marked on comparison, given a great deal of marks for comparison. This one is not. The difference here is that this one is marked specifically for context, and you must be able to use context in your answers precisely, just as you will in your prose exams with Dracula and Dorian Gray. It's a similar skill. You need to be able to utilise the knowledge that I'll be giving you today, and then throughout the rest of the course, of course, to integrate into your analysis in depth. Now, while I say it's not a comparative essay, and it isn't, and you're not marked on your comparison, it would be remiss to say that you will inevitably end up linking the poems together. There will inevitably be comparative sentences because, of course, if you're being asked on 2 poems, there has to be a link between them. So don't go out of your way to not link them together. You won't be marked in the comparison. But to make a succinct and cohesive essay, you will naturally probably do so anyway. So the poems are listed on the right. So we'll be studying Some Ladies Dress in Muslin Full and White, Remember, The World, Echo, May, A Birthday, An Apple Gathering, Maud Clare, At Home, Uphill, Goblin Market, What Would I Give, Twice, Memory, A Christmas Carol, Passing and Glassing, Piteous My Rhyme Is, A Helpmeet for Him, As Froth on the Face of the Deep, Our Mothers, Lovely Women Pitiful, and Babylon the Great. So there are a large number of poems there. I think the same number, if not slightly less, than we will do for what you've done for the modern poetry. And some of those poems you will probably have heard of. So Rossetti's Goblin Market is very, very famous. If you did a quick Google of that, you would come up with hundreds and hundreds of resources. However, some of the poems are little known. So, for example, Our Mother's Lovely Women Pitiful isn't as well known. And actually, if you were to Google that poem, not much comes up. So it's sort of hit and miss about how much information there is on the internet that is good for each of these poems. For most of them there is quite a lot. For some of them there is very, very little, so you'll have to try your best to analyse it as yourself, as well as obviously going with the teacher notes and anything that we can link you to elsewhere. So this is an example of the question paper, very, very similar to everything you've probably seen before. So answer one question on your chosen text, write your answer in the space provided. You must select a poem from the prescribed list for your study collection. The poems are listed in section B of the source booklet, blah, blah, blah. Prescribed text, and then it names the book that I've told you to buy, essentially. And then you either in this case, explore the ways in which Christina Rossetti creates character in Maud Clare and one other poem. You must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. Or explore the ways in which Christina Rossetti makes use of memory in Memory and one other poem. You must relate your discussion to relevant contextual factors. You'll note that both are out of 30. You'll note that it's questions 17 and 18 you will be answering. And you'll also note that the poems are different. So, if there were 20 poems of Rossetti, you can afford, if you're really at a push, to absolutely hate one poem and never look at that poem again. So, for example, if I hated Maud Clare, that's fine because I would do the other question. I would do the question on memory. That plan isn't ideal and doesn't work. Obviously, if there's more than one poem you don't like and hate, but there is that sort of safety net that, if there's a couple of poems that you really like, odds on one of them will come up. There's only so many questions they can ask. And bear in mind, it's got to link to another poem of Rossetti's list. So you can always create links and lists of relevant themes. So we'll be doing that as we go. And you will be fine. So just to break it down, so obviously explore the ways in which Rossetti creates character, or explore the use of memory. You're looking at the theme within the two poems, using the language, the structural techniques, the tone, etc. All the skills you used for modern poetry, you will be using for Rossetti as well. The only difference with this paper is, of course, there is no unseen poem, so you will know both. Here's a look at the mark scheme. Again, very similar to the modern poetry. The only difference is you are marked on AO1, AO2 and AO3, not AO4 as in the modern poetry one. So AO3 is of course the context. So if you look towards band 5, the critical and evaluative one, you're looking at the standard things you would expect from a superb essay. So sustained textual examples, a clear evaluative argument, sophisticated use of concepts and terminology, and uses of sophisticated structure and expression, exhibits a critical evaluation of the way meanings are shaped, and provides a sophisticated evaluation and appreciation of the significance and influence of contextual factors. And by this I mean it's not enough to just say, well, she believed in this, therefore she wrote this poem. You need to be a lot more evaluative of that. So you'll see as we go through some of her context today that there are lights and shadows towards her life, and she's complex in the sense of what she believes about women, for example. So that would be where you need to evaluate what she's saying and how that has influenced certain poems about women that she writes, and how she presents women. Again, we'll talk about those as we go through each of the individual poems, but it's worth noting that you can't just say the basic, she believed this. You need to consider why that would be relevant to the poem you're choosing to discuss. And again, how to be successful, very similar to the modern poetry. You need to understand the poetic language, the structure and the form. You need to understand the poems, of course. You need to be able to embed contextual information successfully, just as you will be doing in the prose exam. And you need to be able to identify connections between the texts. So while you're not marked on comparison, you need to know that there is a connection between the two in some way, particularly on the theme that the exam have given you. So, looking to Rossetti's life then. So Christina Rossetti was born in 1830 in London, and she was the youngest of 4 children to a very scholarly and very literary family. These were very educated people. The parents and all of her siblings were incredibly successful just at life. to a point. Her dad emigrated to London in 1824 and he became a Dante scholar and a teacher of Italian. He married in 1826 to Frances and they had a child every year up until Christina. So in 1827, 28, 29 and 30 they had a child every year. Frances, the wife, was a trained governess and wanted to promote intellectual excellence within her own children. And all four of their children were very successful writers in their own right. And they were all very artistic and they could paint. And they were just very, very gifted people, essentially. So Dante, as in what the dad was a scholar of. So Dante is best known for writing the Divine Comedy, which is a long and narrative poem describing his journey through hell, purgatory, and then onto heaven. This view of the afterlife is representative of the 14th century view of the church. So the fact that there is a hell, a purgatory, and heaven. And the poem is allegorical about the journey to God, and the final lines being of Dante seeing God and finally understanding the mysteries of humanity. Now, Christina's dad was very, very he believed that he was so excited by this poem. He really, really enjoyed it, and that's why he became a scholar and he studied it in great, great depth. And he will or did tell his children about it and his wife about it, and they'd all talk about it together. And so the fact that this text is such a key text to their lives is quite important, because it tells you immediately that this was a religious family. It tells you what their view is, because of course there are different versions of God, and some don't have purgatory and some do, but it tells you very specifically what they believed in. Were an incredibly religious family, which does influence Rossetti's life later on. So Christina had a bit of a rough teenage time, essentially, and it sort of never really got better. So in 1843, the family had severe financial difficulties. Christina's father was diagnosed with persistent bronchitis, which we today would probably know as TB, so very serious illness, and he faced losing his sight. So due to this, he had to give up teaching, and he lived his remaining 11 years suffering with depression, because of course he's given up his life's work. Everything he loved and enjoyed doing, he's now given up because he simply cannot do it. Rossetti's mother, however, Frances, she began teaching to make money, and her older sister, as in Christina's older sister Maria, became a live-in governess, which was Christina's worst nightmare. Christina would have hated to be a governess. And Christina's older brothers also left home. Therefore, Christina's home life became increasingly isolated, because, of course, if all of her siblings have left, and her dad is having issues, is going blind, is suffering with depression, then her mum is out at work all the time, Christina really suffered of loneliness. At 14, Rossetti suffered a nervous breakdown and had to leave, or left school, and she kind of had to. She had bouts of depression and related illnesses from then on. During this period, Christina, her mother, and Maria, the sister, became absorbed into the Anglo-Catholic movement within the Church of England. Okay, and if we read to the box on the right, so it is vitally important you understand the significance of Rossetti turning to religion. It has influenced all of her poetry, or pretty much all of her poetry, as well as the poetics of the Oxford movement, which we'll talk about in another slide in a second. It is also significant that her illness pervades her poetry. Rossetti was a pessimist, in the sense that she truly believed, because she'd had this nervous breakdown and she had depression and she had illnesses related to the depression, she truly believed she would die of an early death. So a lot of her poetry has this almost melancholic undertone, that life is short, and that sometimes life is pain. So that kind of pervades some of her poetry. So during 1848, Dante Gabriel, the older brother of Christina Rossetti, was gathering young men who named themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Although he assumed that Christina would participate, she was never a member of this artistic and literary group. So essentially, he would gather a group of men together, and they would talk about art and symbolism and the poignancy of various pieces of art, whether written or literal paintings. Um, Rossetti's poetry has been described as pre-Raphaelite because of its descriptions of natural detail, a beautiful natural detail, the use of symbols. She uses a lot of symbols. So, for example, Rossetti uses the symbol of doors opening and closing, or just being open or closed, to represent various things. They're often very poignant, and there's often a lot of medievalism in a lot of them, which is a pre-Raphaelite idea. But she was not part of the movement. That's quite key. She did not join this group of young men because she was a woman, and she had her own views, etc. So she was involved in the early days of the pre-Raphaelitism. She sat as Mary for Dante Gabriel's painting of the Girlhood of Mary Virgin. So if you look to the right of the screen, that's her sitting down on the right-hand side of the picture. Her brother painted it, and she was sort of the model for it. And the other painting of 1850. And her pensive Italianate countenance, so basically she looked Italian, was a familiar image in the first phase of the movement. She appeared in a lot of the art because she was essentially a free model for her brother. The art and poetry of the Brotherhood has a strong sacramental element, and Rossetti has had more in common with this early manifestation of the pre-Raphaelite aesthetic than she did with its later developments. So the pre-Raphaelitism, it kept developing into something that wasn't quite meeting with Rossetti's views and ideas, so she sort of backed away from it. But this early start to it, where it's sort of very religious pictures and use of symbols, etc., that is what she kind of agreed with and thought she could get on board with. So Rossetti had a troubled love life. In her late teens, Rossetti became engaged to the painter James Collinson. He was the first of 3 suitors and was a founding member of the Raphaelite Brotherhood, like her brothers Dante and William. They, however, broke up their engagement in 1850 when Collinson went back or reverted back to Catholicism. So he went back to the religion that he had previously been before the pre-Raphaelites. Later, she became involved with the linguist Charles Cayley, but she declined to marry him, also for religious reasons. And the third offer came from the painter John Brett, whom she also refused for very similar reasons, mainly religion. As an adult, Christina Rossetti was described by many to be excessively restrained, which really differed from the excitable and passionate child she once was. This may simply be because she was ill and depressed, or it might have been her religious beliefs and the idea that she needs to take a step back from the pleasures of life and appreciate what God has done, so nature, etc. So she would be a lot calmer. It might be a mix of both. It could be her illness and her religious beliefs that made her this quite restrained figure. So she does a lot of humanitarian work, and in 1854, during the Crimean War, she did try and volunteer with Florence Nightingale nurses, but she was turned down. Her aunt, however, did end up joining Nightingale in Scutari, so Rossetti took over her aunt's job, which was district visiting, so providing assistance to the sick and poor within the parish. So she was kind of helping people in the community. She just wasn't with Nightingale, and she wasn't helping specifically that war. In early 1859, Rossetti began volunteering at the St Mary Magdalene Penitentiary in Highgate, which was a charitable institution for the reclamation of fallen women. As an associate at Highgate, Rossetti was known as Sister Christina and wore a habit-like black uniform with a veil. When she was on duty, she resided in the penitentiary, probably for a fortnight at a time, but no one can quite say. But by the summer of 1859, Rossetti was devoting a good deal of time to her work at Highgate, and its influence can be seen in her poems about illicit love, betrayal, and illegitimacy. So this kind of penitentiary is kind of a prison for women who maybe have turned to prostitution, things like that, where they have fallen from grace, fallen from God. Um, that kind of idea. So Rossetti wanted to help them. So, for example, Goblin Market, which is a very, very famous poem, which you'll be studying later in the term, that entire poem has the theme of a fallen woman being saved by a sister, and it can be seen as being informed by Rossetti's experience at the penitentiary. So that's kind of how you'd link in that context kind of idea and the link to the Highgate Penitentiary with that poem. So Rossetti had complicated views on female suffrage and equality. However, she had tricky views that were, I suppose, of their time. So at times she used the biblical idea of women's subordination to men as reason for maintaining the status quo, while at other times she argued for female representation in Parliament and spoke out against the sexual exploitation of women in society. So some common views at the time were the idea of the angel of the house, which was a common view for 1854, and this was this Victorian idea of being a devoted wife and submissive to a husband. Think the idealised woman, will cook and clean for the husband, always look pretty for them, that kind of idea, just being an absolute, stereotypical angel. And then the fallen woman, so a woman who has lost her innocence and therefore grace with God. So she sort of doesn't quite, so she seems to sometimes adhere to the angel of the house idea because that's, what God would want. But at the same point, she helps the fallen women in the penitentiary. So she has this almost confused idea about what she wants to do. Rossetti sought to support fallen women and she never married. Was deeply religious, but yet refused to support a bill for women's suffrage. So basically, she didn't think women should get the vote. Okay, so she did not think women should get the vote. And you've got to remember at this point, Queen Victoria is on the throne from 1837, in fact. Women didn't get the vote until 1928. So there is this kind of almost 80-year gap where women do not have any power over legislation. And Rossetti thought this was good. Rossetti did not think women should have any say over legislation. So that's a very brief rundown over some context for Rossetti. With each individual poem, we'll of course go through what's relevant to that poem. But I have included two links here. The first is a YouTube link for a Radio 4 podcast called In Our Time Rossetti, and it's well worth a listen. It's from university lecturers, and they're essentially just giving lots and lots of extra detail about Rossetti's life, and that includes, her father and the parenting influences that were had. And then the second link is from the Poetry Foundation, so a very famous website, and this one gives a very detailed exploration of Rossetti's life. It's worth skimming through that one just to see if there are any extra notes that you might want to make regarding her context, because it is very, very key that you know it. And lastly, I'm going to call it home learning, but I guess it's not technically. One, make sure you get a copy of the text, the book that I linked to you at the beginning. It's really, really important that you do that. I'm not going to ask you to do 2, but for 3, there is at the start of the next lesson going to be a mini quiz about Rossetti's life, just to see how you get on and how much you've taken in relation to her life, because it's, again, I can't stress enough how important the context is for these poems.